The year is 1220. A city stands proud behind massive walls that have protected its people for generations. Inside, families gather for evening meals. Children play in courtyards. Merchants close their shops as the sun sets over the horizon. Life continues as it has for centuries. But on the distant plains, something approaches. A dust cloud rises like a dark omen, growing larger with each passing hour. The Mongol horde has arrived. Within days, the walls that seemed impenetrable crumble under relentless siege. The gates fall. Hooves thunder through narrow streets. But what comes next isn't just conquest. It's something far more calculated, far more devastating than simple military defeat. The men who survive the initial assault face execution. That much is expected in medieval warfare. But their wives, their daughters, their mothers, they face something the chronicles describe as worse than death itself. This isn't a story about battlefield tactics or military strategy. This is about what happened after the fighting stopped. About a system so methodical, so psychologically destructive, that entire civilizations chose mass suicide over surrender. Cities that could have held out for months threw open their gates in terror after hearing what awaited their families if they resisted. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territory. He conquered the human spirit itself through tactics that left survivors wishing they had died in battle. What he did to enemy wives became whispered warnings that traveled faster than his armies, breaking the will of nations before a single arrow was fired. The Mongol Empire wasn't built just on horseback and composite bows. It was built on a foundation of calculated terror that specifically targeted women, turning them into weapons of psychological warfare that would echo through generations. If you want to uncover more shocking truths from history that textbooks won't tell you, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't believe what else we've discovered. The Mongol conquest of the 13th century reshaped the entire world. But the methods behind that transformation remain shrouded in euphemism and sanitized history. To understand what really happened, we need to look beyond the romanticized image of skilled horsemen and brilliant military tactics. We need to examine the deliberate strategies that made the Mongol Empire not just feared, but absolutely terrifying. When Mongol forces approached a city, they followed a precise protocol. Envoys would arrive first, offering terms of surrender. Submit immediately, open your gates, and your lives would be spared. Your city would be absorbed into the empire, you'd pay tribute, but you'd survive. Resist and face total annihilation. This wasn't an empty threat. The Mongols had perfected a system of conquest that made examples so brutal, so complete, that the next city would surrender without firing a single arrow. But here's what the history books often gloss over. When a city fell after resistance, the Mongol forces didn't simply kill the defenders and move on. They implemented a carefully organized process of subjugation that specifically targeted women as a central element of their strategy. The surviving wives of enemy soldiers weren't killed quickly. They weren't ransomed. They weren't even simply enslaved in the traditional sense. Instead, they became part of a systematic program that served multiple strategic purposes. First, they were distributed among Mongol warriors as spoils of war. This wasn't random or chaotic. It followed strict hierarchies within the Mongol army. The most beautiful women went to commanders and nobles. Others were distributed to regular soldiers based on rank and merit. But this distribution was just the beginning of their ordeal. These women were forced into unions with the very men who had killed their husbands, their fathers, their brothers. They watched their children from previous marriages killed or enslaved. They were stripped of their identity, their religion, their language, and their culture. They were compelled to bear children for their captors, creating a new generation that would be raised as Mongols, speaking Mongolian, following Mongol customs, with no connection to the civilization that had been destroyed. This wasn't just about satisfying the desires of soldiers, it was demographic warfare. By forcing enemy women to bear Mongol children, Genghis Khan was literally replacing the population of conquered territories with people loyal to the empire. The genetic legacy of this strategy is staggering. Modern DNA studies suggest that approximately 16 million men alive today carry genetic markers traced directly back to Genghis Khan and his male relatives. That's roughly 1 in every 200 men on Earth. This level of genetic saturation doesn't happen through normal reproduction. It happens through systematic, organized programs carried out across multiple generations and vast territories. But the physical aspect was only part of the horror. The psychological warfare was equally calculated. Women who resisted were publicly tortured in ways specifically designed to break the spirit of defenders. The Mongols understood that men fighting to protect their families would fight harder than men fighting for abstract concepts like honor or kingdom. So they made sure that resistance had the highest possible cost, not for the men themselves, but for the women they were trying to protect. Chronicles from Persian, Chinese, and European sources all describe similar patterns. When cities resisted, women were assaulted publicly in front of their families before those families were executed. Mothers were forced to watch atrocities committed against their daughters. Wives were violated in front of their captured husbands before those husbands were killed. These weren't random acts of violence by undisciplined soldiers. They were organized, systematic demonstrations designed to send a message to the next city on the Mongol path. And it worked, terrifyingly well. As word spread about what happened to cities that resisted, more and more chose immediate surrender. Some cities committed mass suicide rather than face Mongol conquest. In certain cases, entire populations threw themselves from city walls or poisoned themselves when they saw the Mongol standards approaching. They chose death on their own terms rather than face what they knew was coming. The Mongols actively encouraged these stories to spread. Survivors were sometimes deliberately released to carry tales of what they'd witnessed. Merchants traveling the Silk Road spread accounts of destroyed cities and the fate of their women. This information warfare meant that the Mongols often conquered territories without fighting at all. The psychological terror did the work that armies would have required. But there's another dimension to this that makes it even more disturbing. Some women were kept alive specifically to be paraded as trophies during subsequent campaigns. High-ranking women, queens, princesses, noblewomen, were sometimes forced to travel with Mongol armies, displayed as symbols of conquered kingdoms. They were dressed in their finest clothes and jewelry, made to ride in processions, serving as living advertisements of Mongol dominance. Imagine being a defender on city walls, watching the captured queen of a neighboring kingdom riding with the enemy forces, knowing that could be your own wife or daughter soon. The administrative systems the Mongols created also reveal the calculated nature of these policies. They kept detailed records of conquered populations, including censuses that tracked women of childbearing age. These weren't just for taxation purposes. They were for systematic repopulation programs. Women were redistributed across the empire, moved far from their homelands, ensuring they could never return or reconnect with their original cultures. In some regions, the Mongols implemented a practice where a percentage of women from each conquered household were claimed as tribute annually. This created a perpetual system of terror, where families never knew when someone they loved might be taken. It wasn't a one-time catastrophe during conquest. It was an ongoing mechanism of control that lasted for generations. The religious dimensions add another layer of horror. Many of the conquered peoples were Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or followed other faiths. Women were often forced to abandon their religions and adopt either Mongol shamanism or whatever faith their new masters followed. They couldn't practice their beliefs, teach them to their children, or maintain any connection to their spiritual identity. This was cultural genocide executed through the systematic targeting of women as vessels of culture and tradition. What makes this particularly insidious is that it was incredibly effective as a governing strategy. By breaking family structures, destroying cultural continuity, and creating new generations with no loyalty to the conquered civilization, the Mongols created an empire that was remarkably stable despite its diversity. The children born from these forced unions grew up as Mongols. They had no allegiance to the kingdoms their mothers came from. They spoke Mongolian. They followed Mongol customs. They served in Mongol armies. The scale of this program was unprecedented in human history. From Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to India, the same patterns repeated across every conquest. Millions of women experienced this fate over the decades of Mongol expansion. Entire ethnic groups were absorbed and disappeared from history. Languages went extinct. Cultural traditions vanished. And at the center of this demographic transformation were women who became unwilling participants in the erasure of their own civilizations. Contemporary accounts from different cultures all express the same sentiment, that what happened to women was considered worse than the death their husbands received. Arab chroniclers wrote that women envied the quick deaths of men. Chinese records describe mothers who killed their daughters rather than let them be captured. European accounts speak of women who mutilated themselves to become less desirable to captors. This reveals something important about medieval societies across Eurasia. Despite their many differences, they all shared certain values about honor, family, and the protection of women. The Mongols understood these shared values and weaponized them. They knew that nothing would break the spirit of defenders faster than the knowledge of what awaited their families. The long-term consequences of these policies extended far beyond the immediate suffering. Societies that experienced Mongol conquest were traumatized for generations. The demographic changes reshaped entire regions. The genetic legacy continues to this day, but perhaps most significantly, the Mongol example influenced future conquerors. Timur, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, used similar tactics centuries later. Other empires studied and sometimes imitated these methods of conquest and control. Yet history often presents Genghis Khan as a complex figure. Brutal but effective, violent but visionary. Museums display Mongol artifacts. Documentaries focus on military innovations and administrative genius. Mongolia itself celebrates him as a national hero and founding father. This sanitization of history erases the experiences of millions of women who suffered under policies deliberately designed to be worse than death. Understanding this dark chapter isn't about demonizing modern Mongolians or engaging in historical revenge. It's about acknowledging the full truth of how empires were built and the specific ways that women's bodies and lives were used as tools of conquest. It's about recognizing that military history isn't just about tactics and battles. It's about the human cost of those tactics, especially for those who had no choice in their participation. The Mongol conquest remind us that military success and moral horror can coexist in the same historical moment. An empire can be administratively sophisticated and genocidally brutal simultaneously. Leaders can be brilliant strategists and systematic perpetrators of atrocities. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They coexist, creating a complex historical legacy that we must confront honestly rather than simplify into hero narratives or pure villainy. What happened to enemy wives under Mongol rule was, indeed, worse than death by medieval standards. Not because death is preferable to life, but because the life imposed on them involved the complete destruction of everything that gave their existence meaning. Their families, their cultures, their identities, their autonomy, their children's futures, all were systematically erased while they remained alive to witness and participate in that erasure.